very much, Dee, and welcome everybody. Welcome to the team that have joined us on the panel from ISC, Ag Communicators, PIRSA and Livestock SA. It's great that we can present this webinar together tonight. So as Dee said, we've got a lot of information to get through for the session this evening, and hopefully you'll go away with some really practical tips that'll help you on farm with your record keeping. So the agenda for this evening, I just wanted to outline the role of Integrity Systems Company, talk a little bit about the importance of the red meat integrity system, and then look at each of the integrity system programs, and then get into the detail around some record keeping tips that will help you as part of your LPA accreditation and if you were asked to participate in an audit. So just to start off with, where and what is Integrity Systems Company and how does that fit into the red meat industry structure? Well, this is the national red meat industry outlined on the screen here at the moment, and ISC, or Integrity Systems Company, is a subsidiary of Meat and Livestock Australia, which is a service provider to the industry. So MLA and ISC provide industry services on behalf of producers and others in the industry. Now, the organisations in the top row there, they're focused on policy and strategy. They're often referred to as peak industry councils, and they advocate on behalf of producers to a range of decision makers. And all of those organisations on the slide there have separate roles, but they all work together to support the industry. A little bit about Meat and Livestock Australia. So MLA is responsible for research, development and adoption and marketing activities on behalf of the red meat industry. We do that by collaborating with the Australian government and the wider red meat industry to invest in those R&D and marketing activities. And the way that we do that is that transaction levies, or the levies that are paid on the sale of livestock, they're matched with Australian government funds up to a certain point, and then they're invested by MLA under the direction and guidance of those peak industry councils in R&D and marketing activities. And those initiatives that are invested in by MLA contribute to producer profitability, sustainability and global competitiveness. So Integrity Systems Company, on the other hand, so a subsidiary of Meat and Livestock Australia, we manage and deliver Australia's red meat integrity system. Now, this system underpins consumer confidence in on-farm production of Australian red meat, and it ensures that Australian red meat is safe to eat and fully traceable, provides on-farm assurance, animal identification and lifetime traceability, and the system underpins the livestock selling system, giving confidence to buyers, retailers and consumers. So just to put all of this into context, the Australian red meat industry is a $28 billion industry. It employs 400,000 people across 80,000 businesses and delivers product to 100 global markets all around the world. So the red meat integrity system that underpins that is really important to the livestock sector. The system underpins consumer confidence in on-farm production of Australian red meat, and it covers the on-farm assurance, or the livestock management component, and that's delivered through the Livestock Production Assurance Program, or LPA. And the second is identification and traceability of livestock, and that's through the National Livestock Identification System, or NLIS. Now, it's this overall system made up of those two programs that supports our domestic and international markets. And because of this, our red meat produced here in Australia is trusted and highly sought after all around the world. Now, there are multiple producers and many properties ranging in size all around Australia. It's the integrity system that's really about delivering one measure of quality through one integrity system. And we all have a role to play to ensure that we can stand by what we sell. Now, just as a quick refresher, because I understand we've probably got varying degrees of experience and knowledge on the webinar this evening, there are two programs which work together to underpin the red meat industry's food safety and traceability on farm. So as I said, the first of those, Livestock Production Assurance, or LPA, that's all about on-farm assurance, covering on-farm management of food safety, animal welfare and biosecurity risks. And it's the tick of assurance for your product from producer through to consumer. And it demonstrates the professionalism of the industry and underpins our market access for Australian red meat. The other program that I mentioned previously is the National Livestock Identification System, or NLIS. And it's all about identification and traceability, and it tracks the location of every animal throughout its life. It's mandatory for producers and endorsed by major producer, feedlot, agent, sale yard and processor bodies. And the NLIS is underpinned by state and territory legislation and enhances Australia's ability to track livestock during disease or food safety incidences such as chemical residues and things like that. Now, there are 3 other components to the system which are really, really important and bring it all together. The first of those is the Property Identification Code, or the PIC. Now, a PIC is required for registration with both LPA and NLIS. PICs are managed independently by state and territory departments of agriculture, and by incorporating a PIC into the LPA and NLIS, that's really the only way that traceability and food safety can be managed at a national level. And the 2 other elements which make up the program, one of those is the LPA National Vendor Deck, which is required for when livestock move through the value chain, and we'll touch on that a little bit later. And then, of course, record keeping across both LPA and NLIS. And all of this is really important as red meat producers, that you keep those records on farm as part of both the LPA and NLIS. So when it comes to being part of livestock production assurance, it means that producers need to keep your online LPA account details up to date. You need to maintain your LPA accreditation. So this means that as producers, you need to complete the LPA learning and assessment. You need to, and the assessment, is a series of multiple choice questions which you need to answer correctly to receive that accreditation. Producers renew accreditation every 3 years to ensure that their knowledge of the program remains current. So that's why it's a 3-year cycle. And accreditation gives you more options for marketing your livestock, and because it means that you can access those LPA national vendor decks for all livestock movements between PICs. You also need to manage your livestock and your property in line with the 7 LPA on-farm requirements, and these are outlined in the rules and standards, but they go across property risk assessments, safe and responsible animal treatments, stock foods, fodder crops, grain and pasture treatments, preparation for dispatch of livestock, livestock transactions and movements, biosecurity and animal welfare, and we'll touch on each of those for most of the webinar this evening. Also need to maintain thorough records as evidence of livestock history and on-farm practices, and you also need to be prepared to undergo an audit if requested. Because LPA is an audited accreditation, so as a livestock producer you agree to complete an audit when asked. And this is what provides that accountability from paddock to plate for our customers. So for the National Livestock Identification System, as a producer, you need to keep your online NLIS account details up to date. You need to order and use NLIS tags as identifiers for every animal on your PIC. Now, the required tag type can differ a bit between the states, but every animal must be tagged with an accredited NLIS device and can't be moved to another PIC without one, including to another farm, feedlot, sale yard or processor. You need to record movements of livestock in the NLIS database. Now, livestock transfers between PICs must be recorded by transferring the tags in the database, and the person receiving the livestock is responsible for completing the transfer. All producers need to regularly check their own records against the database to ensure that those transfers have been completed. And this is really important if you're relying on someone else to make the transfer. You need to check that that's actually happened. And it's also recommended that you do a PIC reconciliation each year to ensure that the database is an accurate record of the devices and the livestock on your property. So when it comes to LPA national vendor decks, we want to be really clear on what producers need to do. So the first is you need to maintain that LPA accreditation to continue to access NVDs. NVDs are a legal document, so when ticking boxes or signing an NVD, your declaration needs to be backed up by accurate farm records. You need to ensure that your NVDs are clear, complete and correct. You need to file and store your completed and received NVDs, and you also should check that NVDs have a corresponding NLIS transfer to or from your PIC. NLIS transfers, as I've said, and related NVDs are certainly reviewed during an LPA audit. So we've given a bit of a refresher there about the different elements or programs that make up the red meat integrity system. Now we're going to go into a little bit more detail around the LPA and the record keeping, because good records and systems are the foundation of the integrity system. The webinar is really going to be around record keeping and what you need to do to meet your requirements as part of LPA, and importantly, hopefully go away with some practical tips that will help you do that. So I guess when it comes to record keeping for LPA, there really is no perfect formula when it comes to record keeping, and hence we ask that question because there are a myriad of ways that you can keep your records. In terms of how some producers find that keeping clear notes in a diary or a record book works well for them, others tend to keep their records within farm management software program or computer spreadsheets. And regardless of the method, it's important that all the relevant management activities are accurately and clearly recorded and capture the required information. And should you be required to participate in an LPA audit, your LPA records will be reviewed by an auditor. So it's important to make sure that they're accurate and up to date. It's particularly important producers get records in order well before an audit. An audit is not the time to do this or to suddenly go in a mad flurry to try and get your records in order. And neither should an audit be the only motivation for keeping records. Providing lifetime traceability and record keeping can also be a marketing advantage for you as you're wanting to sell or transfer livestock as well, if you're able to tell a story around those animals. But to make it easier for you, ISC's created record keeping templates which are aligned to the 7 LPA requirements and outline all the information that you need to be recording. Now, these are available on the ISC website, and you can see there that we've got a little integrity insight on the slide. We've got a couple of those throughout tonight's webinar. So keep your eye on those, but as Dee said, we'll be sending out a fairly detailed post-webinar email as well with a whole heap of tips and resources as well. You can order those through the LPA website as well, or you can call customer service and the numbers there on the screen if you'd like a hard copy. But I guess the other thing just to keep in mind with record keeping is that don't think of record keeping just in isolation of LPA. You'll be keeping records across other aspects of your business. There's an opportunity to keep those together or for other programs. And we'll talk about some of the SA requirements later on, and you'll see that particularly around biosecurity and things like that, you don't have to do a separate biosecurity record keeping for one program versus the other. They should all be quite complementary in the way that you keep those records. A recent change has been made to the LPA, so the Livestock Production Assurance website, and it now allows all your LPA documentation and records to be saved directly within your LPA account. Now, our integrity insight for this new feature is the option to also complete your property risk assessment and farm biosecurity plans entirely digitally rather than on a printed template, so you can actually do them from scratch. The benefits of keeping your record keeping in your LPA account is that it has all your records in one location. You can retrieve them at any time, and of course there's easy access for auditing. We've got a fact sheet for how to create or upload documents in your LPA account, and that's on the ISC website. And again, keep an eye out for that post-webinar email. In terms of the different types of records that you might be required to keep as part of the integrity system, there's usually two main types of records. There's records that we refer to which are property management records. Now these are completed and reviewed once a year, for example. These are things like the property risk assessment, the biosecurity plan, and your animal welfare certification. And the other types of records are what we'd refer to as operational records. Now these are things that are usually filled out daily or weekly, and are activity-based and can include things like your visitor registers for biosecurity, feed and livestock treatment records as you're doing them, commodity vendor decks as you're receiving stock feed, and then your national vendor decks and your livestock movements. Now, there are there's plenty of opportunities to utilise your current record keeping systems for the purposes of LPA, and that's totally fine. So there's no need to create duplicate records using the LPA templates if you've got a current system that can be utilised. So the important thing is that you just understand what's required from an LPA record keeping, and then to make your record keeping that you do on your farm fit that purpose, as well as any other records you're required to keep. And a good example of that is around your chemical records as part of chemical treatments. So what I'm going to do now is take a look at each of the 7 different requirements for the LPA and take you through basically what you need to do to meet the requirement, and then to give you some examples of some record keeping templates or some practical tips. So the first LPA requirement we're going to have a look at is property risk assessments. Now, for this requirement, you must identify any possible risk on your property where livestock could come into contact with physical and/or chemical contaminants, and you need to develop strategies for how this risk will be controlled or managed. To meet this requirement, you need to complete a risk assessment and a map. You need to update the risk assessment when changes occur on farm. You need to document and file the risk assessment and map for auditing, and this can be done completely digitally in your LPA account. Now, here's an example risk assessment map, and this is available as part of our record keeping templates. A risk assessment must be carried out when any changes to the enterprise's current activities occur, such as a change in land use on the property, for example. It requires that you mark on a property map any suspect areas, such as old yards or dip sites, treated yards, old rubbish dump sites, treated power poles and things like that. And you can see those risk areas marked on the examples on the screen. Here's another example from the ISC record keeping template. This is an example where risks are documented and a description provided of how the site is being managed to eliminate the risk of contamination. And you can see that the first example there is an old rubbish dump. So the types of information that you're capturing as part of your risk assessment is what the possible risk or the risk site was and referring to it on the property map, the reason or the risk that was identified, any results or analysis that you may have done that would just add further information to what the risk is and how you're going to manage it, and then a little description of how the site is being managed to eliminate the risk, which is of livestock contamination. So the first one there is a rubbish dump. The risk was around old chemical drums and batteries. There's been some soil samples done, which is identified dieldrin and BHC, so you're just putting that information in there. And then your risk mitigation is around the rubbish dump was fenced out in 2005 to keep animals from accessing that particular risk. So the next requirement for LPA that we're going to look at is biosecurity. So for this requirement, you must implement on-farm biosecurity systems to minimise the risk of infectious disease being introduced to livestock production properties and the subsequent spread of any of those diseases. Now, to meet this requirement, you're required to keep a formal documented farm biosecurity plan. And this can be completed digitally in your LPA account now. You need to source a livestock health declaration or equivalent for introduced livestock. You need to have systems to notify unusual disease, illness or mortalities. And you should also keep records of movements of people, vehicles and equipment entering your property where it's both reasonable and practical. Now, just a note there that some producers may have also completed a JBAS or a YONIS farm biosecurity plan, and this will also meet your LPA requirements. And if, as I said earlier, you've used another program or a template to create a biosecurity plan, and there are plenty of biosecurity templates out there, just make sure that it covers all the required information that's required from the LPA template to make sure you're compliant with that. But then absolutely you can use a different biosecurity template for other requirements or for other programs such as state-based biosecurity as well. So here's an example of from the ISC record keeping templates. It's a formal documented farm biosecurity plan, and it must address things like managing and recording the introduction and movement of livestock in a way that minimises that risk of introducing disease. Where reasonable and practical, as I said, controlling people, equipment and vehicles entering the property, thus minimising the potential for property contamination of pest diseases and weeds, and keeping a record of those movements, and preventing and controlling animal disease on farm by regulatory monitoring and managing the livestock. Now, the key with biosecurity is to focus on what's relevant to your farm and your production system and any specific requirements that relate to your state and territory. It doesn't mean that you need to tick every box on the template, because some things may not be applicable to your situation. The important thing to consider is that is identifying what risks apply to your farm, and that with your business risk appetite, how you're going to manage those risks. So a good example, and as I said, biosecurity depends on the risks, it depends on your system, and depends on your location. So just a practical example. So here we are superfine wool producers. I've actually got 7 neighbours, and I've got a river that goes through the property as well. Most of the neighbours are on small holdings, and certainly don't have merinos, so have crossbred sheep as well. So our biggest concern is the introduction of lice from neighbouring properties, and also weeds which are travelling down through the watercourses. So big biosecurity things for us are boundary fencing and regular weed control and inspection. Now, that may not be of any relevance to others in a much more extensive operation, same as certain things such as batteries and old dip sites and things like that are not of relevance to our system. So biosecurity, definitely not a one size fits all. There's definitely no correct answers. It really is around identifying the risks for your operation and how you're going to manage those yourself. And the important thing is that it's documented. And the other thing with biosecurity is that producers have been managing biosecurity for years. It's just now that we are simply asking for that to be documented, so that we can tell a story to our customers and say that our producers are taking biosecurity seriously, and that they are proactively managing that risk. Now, on the screen, we've got an example of a property visitor register. This is one of the record keeping templates that's available on the ISC website. You can, as I said, use one of these templates or set it up in a spreadsheet, and the information that's captured there is simply the date, the name, the company where the visitor came from, their signature, contact details, the reason for the visit, where they visited on the farm, they might have only been in certain areas, and the time in and time out. And of course, this is not only so that you can document it to say that you've documented, but it also, of course, helps you manage any issues as they arise. The next requirement that we'll look at for LPA is around animal welfare. Now, animal welfare is a really important requirement of LPA, which was introduced in 2017. To meet this requirement, you need to have a copy of the animal welfare standards and guidelines accessible as a reference. Now, the person responsible for the property, or the person that has the LPA accreditation, must have received training in the standards and guidelines, and that can be done through the LPA learning program. And staff involved in livestock husbandry on the property need to be familiar with the contents of the standards and guidelines and have been trained in a manner consistent with those standards and guidelines. Now, the integrity insight there is to download those standards and guidelines and save it as a favourite or bookmark it, so that all your team members know where it is and that they can access it. And we'll send you that link around following tonight's webinar. Now, here's an example of the animal welfare certificate that's generated after you've done the LPA learning and the assessment process, and you need to have that as part of your records and available should you be asked to participate in an LPA audit. Now, the next requirement that we're going to look at is around safe and responsible animal treatments. Now, for this requirement, you must undertake steps to ensure that animal treatments are administered in a safe and responsible manner that minimises the risk of chemical residues and also physical hazards. Now, to meet this requirement, you need to document and file all animal treatment details. You need to complete a chemical user course. Note when equipment used for livestock treatment is cleaned. You should record authorisation and directions for any off-label use of chemicals. You need to note animals that have been exposed to any physical contaminants like broken needles, and you must mark animals treated with HGPs with a triangular ear mark. Now, the integrity insight there is to keep those records for a minimum of 3 years in accordance with your state legislation, or for the time the livestock are on the pick, whichever is the longest, because of course when you need to complete your NBD, you may need to look back at those records to accurately fill out your national vendor deck. So here on the screen, this is an example of a livestock treatment record. And as I said earlier, of course, these can be done in hard copy online. You can get this in online, or you can certainly copy it straight across into a spreadsheet. And the same type of information is also captured if you're using farm management software. The information you need to record is the treatment date, the description, the location and number of livestock, the trade name or the chemical details, the batch number, the dose rate that you used, the withholding period and ESI, and then a date that they're safe for slaughter and treated by. And these types of, particularly that information there around dates safe for slaughter, it just helps you keep an easy, ready reckoner when you need to go and move those animals, and you're not having to sort of calculate as you're down at the yards trying to load sheep or cattle and working out whether or not they're still in a withholding period. So it's handy just to capture that information. You know that the days that they're going to actually be safe for slaughter. So the integrity insight there, a couple of tips for this one. You can ask your supplier to add the vet product batch number and expiry date and the withholding period or ESI to the invoice for your treatment records, and you can just keep that as well. And if you don't know what the withholding period or the ESI is, you can visit the APVMA website. You don't need to remember that. We'll circulate that link later on. And just be careful, because withholding periods and export slaughter intervals are regularly not the same. And another little tip there, you can, as I said, you can get your supplier to provide you with those information on your invoice. But don't forget that we've all got smartphones now, and you can take a photo of most things. So something else you can do, and because photos, of course, are date stamped on smartphones, it's also very handy because you know what the treatment date might have been. Take a photo of the drum of chemical, for example. You can have the mob of sheep in the background. If they're looking at you, you'll get their tag color, so you'll know their age and probably the mob as well. So there's your record keeping done really quickly. Same as when you're out marking calves as they're born, for example. If you're popping tags in, just take a photo of it and add it to the notes function on your phone, and then you've got an immediate record as well. So there is some fairly handy things that you can do that are easily at your fingertips as well. Here's an example of the chemical inventory record keeping example, again from the ISC record keeping templates. Again, you can ask your supplier to add the product batch number and expiry date to the invoice for your treatment records. But the examples here, the type of information is the date that the product was received on farm, the product name and the quantity, the expiry date or the date of manufacture, batch number, and who would have been, so the updated by, so who took receipt of that product and put it into the chemical store, for example. Again, these types of records are required for your farm chemical user course as well. So make sure that you don't necessarily think that you've got to do duplicate records here, that if you're keeping one lot of records, it should be sufficient for both programs. So the next requirement that we'll take a look at is stock foods, fodder crops, grain and pasture treatments. Now for this particular requirement, you must guarantee that animals are not exposed to foods containing chemical contamination or fed animal products. Now, to meet this requirement, you need to keep records of all agricultural chemical treatments as well, so not just livestock treatments. You need to document any introduced stock feed. You need to have management systems to identify livestock that may have become contaminated. You need to map or list any treated or contaminated sites, and you should also try and source and file a commodity vendor declaration that accompany any introduced stock feed. So an example here of the crop, pasture and paddock treatment record. So the types of information that you would be capturing here is the date of application, the paddock and the location, the crop that was treated, how much area was treated, who it was treated by, what the application rate was and the method, there was any wind direction and speed, and then details around the tank mix as well. So product name, chemical rate, your batch number, withholding period, that type of information. Again, similar to the livestock treatment, the date that the safe to harvest or safe to graze a particular crop, and then any notes. So you'll see that this type of information has application across the business as well. And there's a couple of areas where I could see that this could become useful. So if, for example, there was a spray drift incident, you would be able to demonstrate through capturing your records what the actual conditions were on the day, for example. Other issues might be if you do have a adverse reaction or a grazing incident, something like that. Again, you've got those records, or it might also be useful if you had a work health and safety issue as well. So these records, whilst they're important and a requirement as part of LPA, certainly have a practical application across other areas of your business. This example here on the slide is around a grain and fodder treatment record. So this is when hay and silage may have been treated. So again, things like the date, the silage or the storage ID, the product that was treated, the amount that was treated, the application rate, who did it, and whether or not they were owner, employee or contractor, and then information about the chemicals. So the actual product, the rate, the batch number, withholding period, etc., the date the produce is safe to be fed out, and then any other information as well. This example of the screen here is around introduced stock feed. So this is grain and hay and or pellets and commercially produced materials that you might be bringing on farm to feed out. So again, the information you'd like to be capturing here is the date, the feed stuff and how much you received, where it came from, whether or not you had a commodity vendor deck or an equivalent reference number, whether there was any residue analysis provided with that material and where you stored it, and then again, who took receipt of it on farm or who created the records. And similarly, there's also a requirement to keep the livestock feeding records. And again, this has got very practical use across the business. So for example, if you're looking at different mobs, for example, or different areas of the property, then you can look back over a time frame and see what totals are. You might like to capture other information such as cost, and that could also be very helpful when it comes to doing gross margins and cost of production and things like that as well. So these, again, all types of records that you would be keeping anyway, but it's just making sure that you're also meeting those requirements as part of the LPA program. So a description of the feed stuff, where it was stored, what was fed out, the feeding period from start to finish, and then the person responsible for activity. And this could be quite useful, again, if you had an animal health incident on farm and you needed to go back and work out what it was and where it came from and storage and things like that. On the screen here now is an example of a commodity vendor declaration. Now, all introduced stock feed should be accompanied by a commodity vendor deck to guarantee that the feed purchased is safe from chemical contamination. Now, the commodity vendor deck needs to provide details of the chemical used to treat the commodity, the rate and date of application, and any details around the withholding period or the export slaughter interval from the label. Now, in the absence, if you can't get a commodity vendor deck, then you need to assess the risk and keep a record of that risk. Or you can just apply a standard 60-day withholding period from the date that you actually received the product. Alternatively, you could also have a sample tested for residues of the produce itself. Now, in the post-webinar email, we'll provide you with some more information about commodity vendor declarations. Now, commodity vendor decks are only for hay and grain, for example. Pellets and commercially manufactured feeds don't require a commodity vendor deck. The next LPA requirement is preparation for dispatch of livestock. And for this one, you need to guarantee that livestock are fit to transport and ensure that they experience minimal stress and contamination during assembly and transport. Now, to meet this requirement, you need to ensure that all livestock are fit to load. You need to record transport details, including the vehicle registration and key times. You need to document and file your LPA national vendor decks, and you need to record reports of animals which may have been exposed to any physical contaminants. Now, the integrity insight there is to keep a copy handy of the is the animal fit to load guide or the fit to load guide. It's got some really handy pictures in there in terms of what actually constitutes fit to load and what doesn't, particularly around things like cancers, other injuries that you might have previously thought were okay to, in particular, end up in a sale yard, and very useful for condition scoring and checking what's appropriate and fit to load, particularly in dry times. So there's an example on the screen now of a preparation of livestock for dispatch record. So things here that you should be keeping an eye on is the date, the number of livestock to be loaded or to be moved, the description, of course, the date and time of yarding, and the date and time of dispatch, and any comments that might have been there. And you'll see that when you're keeping these records, that these are the types of information now that you will actually need to be able to refer to when filling in your national vendor deck, and that they should sort of complement each other. Absolutely. So, livestock transactions and movements. For this requirement, you must guarantee that animals sold are not exposed to any food safety hazards and that they meet all traceability requirements should a safety issue occur. So the way that you do this to meet those requirements is that you need to record all purchases and sales. You need to keep copies of all LPA national vendor decks. You need to record the vendor's name, address and PIC. You need to record livestock details in the description, keep records of all animals purchased while within a withholding period or export slaughter interval, and you need to document the detail of any animals that may have been exposed to physical contaminants. Now, the biggest tip to stand by what you sell in regards to that particular requirement and also the whole LPA program is to make sure that every NVD is filled out so that it is clear, complete and correct. Now, the questions in Part A of the National Vendor Deck are often where producers need a bit of a hand. Now, these questions are about the animal's history. This information is crucial for food safety and market access. So the key here is to stay on the safe side. And if in doubt, tick yes and check your records to be sure. Now, the only question where you shouldn't tick yes is around the livestock ownership. So if you bred the livestock, you tick yes. If you purchased one or more animals within a particular consignment that is covered by that NVD, then you need to tick no and indicate the most recent date of purchase. Now, a couple of other things to note is that sometimes the consignee and the destination may be different and have a different property identification code. And it's really important that you identify this on the LPA National Vendor Deck. Now, in the consigned to section, you need to record the full name and address of the person and or company that the livestock are being consigned to. And as I said, sometimes that's actually different to the physical location. And a really good example of that is when transporting livestock to be sold at a sale yard. So the consignee would be your livestock agent and the destination is the sale yard location. Now, we've got lots of tips for filling in the NVD so it is clear, complete and correct, and we'll share those with you after the webinar. The final step for Part A in the NVD is the declaration. Now, just a reminder, when you tick the box on your LPA NVD and you sign it, that you are guaranteeing that your on-farm practices meet those LPA requirements and ultimately our customer expectations. So your tick must be backed up by accurate farm records. Now, for those of you who are LPA accredited, you also have access to the faster, easier ENVD system. It's more accurate than paper forms and ensures that the latest version of the NVD is always being used. It reduces time and duplication spent completing livestock assurance and health declarations. It reduces the cost of storing and retrieving historical consignments for auditing or for reporting and other admin purposes. And you also don't need to wait for new NVD books to arrive. And stakeholders along the supply chain can also log in and view any consignments, including those that are receiving consignments of animals. Now, the other thing that's really important in terms of this livestock movements requirement is being able to record livestock movements through the National Livestock Identification System database. And it's really important that you do that to remain LPA accredited. Now, if a producer is selected to participate in an audit, the auditor will review whether all the transfers for livestock moved onto the PIC have been recorded. and failure to do that will be recorded as a non-conformance by the auditor and may actually lead to suspension of an LPA accreditation, which then also removes access to national vendor decks. Now, the integrity insight there is that state legislation also requires that the buyer or receiver of the livestock completes the transfer on the database, as we've just talked about in our little poll question, and penalties may be imposed by the state and territory government for failing to complete these as required. So an example there on the screen now of some records around livestock purchases and movements. So the types of information that you're capturing there is the date, the serial number from the NVD, the number of stock and the destination paddock, information around the breed, the sex, and the vendor name and address. So this is for animals that are coming onto the property, and any notes associated with those. Similarly, you might have an example. So this is for livestock moving off the property. So this would be livestock sales and movements. Again, the date, the serial number of the national vendor deck, the number of stock and the paddock of origin, the breed, sex, destination. And it might also be handy for this sort of information if you also wanted to capture deaths as well on farm, and that would certainly help you with your PIC reconciliation later on. And we will be doing some future webinars around NLIS, and we'll be able to take you through some NLIS deep dive and some tips there for keeping up-to-date records on the NLIS. So just to finish up, I guess we just wanted to take you through what actually is involved with an LPA audit. And the key thing there is don't panic, that audits are about identifying areas for practical on-farm improvement. As I said earlier, it is a condition of accreditation that producers agree to participate in an audit process, and that LPA audits are conducted each year to ensure that management systems are introduced by livestock producers that comply with those rules and standards of the Livestock Production Assurance Program. All LPA accredited producers may be audited, and approximately 3,000 audits are done each year. And as part of that, if you are asked to participate in an audit, your LPA records will be reviewed. So it's important to make sure that they're accurate and up to date. Now, what if issues are identified during an audit? Well, if the issue is minor, then the auditor may record what's called an observation, which means that the producer needs to take some action to improve the relevant practice. And things such as not obtaining a commodity vendor deck for purchase fodder, or not correctly completing an NVD, for example, where the destination and the consignee have different addresses, that might result in an observation being listed. However, if the issue is more significant, then the auditor may raise what's referred to as a corrective action request. And this means that as a producer, you actually need to take action to ensure compliance with the relevant requirement and submit evidence of that to close out the corrective action. Now, a common CAR or corrective action request is where there's no biosecurity plan in place, or where there's discrepancies between NVDs and NLIS transfers on the database. Now, the important thing to note there is that CARs can now be managed by emailing the required evidence directly to the auditor, or you can actually upload the evidence to your LPA account now. And that's a recently added feature to the LPA Service Centre. The tip there for you, the insight is you can access the how to respond to an LPA corrective action request fact sheet on the Integrity Systems website. We'll circulate a link after the webinar, and that image up there on the screen just shows you a screenshot of the how-to guide and what the Service Centre actually looks like as well for managing your audits. But just to finish up, where do you go for more information to help you through your record keeping? There's lots of information on the ISC website, including the templates for record keeping, the checklists for how you meet each of those requirements for the program. There's also lots of information now on the LPA Service Centre as well, including the ability to upload your online records or completing your biosecurity plan and your risk assessment completely online. You can also keep up to date with us through Integrity Matters, which is our monthly email, which just for everybody's information, you'll keep an eye out for it now. It's due to go out tomorrow. We're also on social and digital, so Facebook, Twitter, and we have some great resources now on YouTube as well. And just before I do finish up and we go to a couple of questions, just the usual disclaimer, but in particular the NVD, just to remember that it is a declaration and it's your declaration. We can't do it for you. Your livestock agent can't do it for you. But we're certainly here to help you and provide you with information to make it as easy as possible. So Dee, that's it from me. Happy to hand over to you to take any questions.
Excellent. Great. Thank you so much, Kathleen. Lots of great information in there. Now, folks, just a reminder, Q&A, we've got the ISC team on the line with PIRSA and Livestock SA. It's not that often we get all of the Brains Trust in the one place. So if you've got any questions, pop them in the Q&A and we'll get straight on to answering them while we're working through some questions for the team. Also, we're going to put the survey evaluation link in the chat. We would really love your thoughts on this webinar format. Is it useful to you? Is there other topics you'd like us to cover? Just click on that link and give us your feedback. That would be awesome. Rightio, so we're going to get straight into questions and we're going to go to the PIRSA team for a start off. So Andrew Ewers in the biosecurity team. So Andrew, can you just give us a quick pitch why producers should be getting involved with One Biosecurity? What's in it for them? Can you give us the lowdown?
Yeah, sure. I'll try and be very quick, but it's a very holistic program, and the reason why SA producers should become 1B members is that it's a program that was developed by South Australian producers and PIRSA for South Australian producers, and its purpose is to build biosecurity of individuals as property units, but also collectively as an industry. And so because it's online, it has probably, there's features there that make it easy for producers to fill out a biosecurity plan, to actually set one up. It also makes it measurable, so you can rate your plan or measure it against industry standards and make improvements if you want to, or be able to see how you're going as far as your biosecurity on your property. The other thing it provides is a disease focus, so it enables you to do questionnaires on endemic diseases, and that then gives people a disease status or a disease risk rating for those endemic diseases, and that's helpful because people find that skills them in understanding diseases better, makes them able to deal with disease issues on their property, but also skills them and gets them ready for, hopefully we don't have it, but exotic disease outbreaks. If they occur, people are a lot more able to either prevent them or prepared for them, or to respond to them and to detect them. Another aspect of the fact that it's online makes it accessible. So it's not stuck away in your filing cabinet. It's something that you can get on and change if you want to go through and review your plan, make any changes or improvements. The other thing about it being online also is it's shareable. And so that's a benefit in terms of providing a framework for risk-based trading. So because you can share your information, the more producers that are on it, the ability is there to be able to see other people's disease risk ratings, their biosecurity plans, and you can then make wise decisions or informed decisions on whether those producers match the risks that you have for your property and the standards that you have in terms of disease status or biosecurity practices. And then also the fact that it's successful means that a summary data can be taken and used by PIRSA in disease surveillance, which is necessary for our market access. So governments talk to governments. So in terms of international markets, the governments are asking South Australia, what's your biosecurity status like? This gives us the opportunity to be able to, in summary form, demonstrate that we have a high standard of biosecurity, and we can show that with across the state. And the final thing is that it's easy to verify. Being online, it means that it's very easy for PIRSA to be able to check up people's entries and to see whether they match some of the databases and information that we have. And so we do online audits regularly. And if we need to do any further, we can do some on-farm audits as well. So really, it's about building South Australia's biosecurity status. The more people that are members, the more benefits each individual gets, and the more benefit that we as a state industry of sheep and beef and dairy are able to get in terms of premium access to premium markets.
Excellent. Thanks, Andrew. That was a very succinct overview of One Biosecurity. From our point of view in South Australia, it might be something that producers have been, seeing crop up in their newsletters or social media, or seeing you guys out at field days.
Yes.
So we will put some more information on One Biosecurity and how you can actually sign up to that program in the post-webinar email, as well as if people have got queries about where they can get more information. So
and I'm here available on ClearPass as well for anyone who wants to type questions in. We're happy to answer both now or over the coming days.
Excellent. Great. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Now, secondly, we'll come over to Denise Rendell in PIRSA's team, Senior Officer for NLIS. Now, Denise, good records we know are not only needed for LPA and audits. From your point of view with NLIS, why else are good records important?
Thanks, Deanna. Yes, good records are extremely important. Not only are they a legal requirement to comply with livestock being moved, either when you sell or give away animals, you are required to actually complete a movement document, and the NVD actually complies with that. There are also times when other documentation, such as the sheep health declaration, must also be completed and given to anyone you give sheep or sell sheep to. These documents are absolutely vital in a disease investigation or an investigation for the purposes of a residue that may have been discovered in meat sometime down after the animal's been processed. These documents can be extremely helpful to you to actually get you out of a major problem. So it is essential that you actually keep those records and obtain those records whenever you buy stock. And the thing in South Australia is that, unfortunately, when we have audited producers in the past, there have been occasions where we've not been able to obtain documents because they think that after a year or two, they can dispose of them. In South Australia, it's actually a legal requirement to keep those records on farm for 7 years. So not just for LPA purposes, but for your own disease and residue history, it's a vital thing to have those legally underpinned documents on farm.
Great, thank you, Denise. That was my next question. So we're really clear, we are keeping records in South Australia for 7 years.
That's correct.
7 years, excellent, great, thank you. Now we'll come over to Livestock SA. We've got Penny Keynes in the biosecurity team. So Penny, tell us about the work of the biosecurity team, and I know you've got some events coming up, so give us an insight into what people should be looking out for here in SA.
Thanks, Deanna. Great messages today, and something that Livestock SA and the work that we're doing through our biosecurity extension program is really focusing on some of these messages. So I'm Penny from Livestock SA, and I work together with Emily Buddle from Animal Health Australia. So together we are putting on a program of workshops, etc., to be able to improve the biosecurity in South Australia. So to improve productivity and profitability and secure market access by strengthening biosecurity across the red meat and wool supply chains. So what does that look like? We've been doing a lot of communications that you might see come through. We've also got some really good tips and tricks through through our bulletin, which you can sign up to through Livestock SA, and also through our Facebook tip of the week. So if you want some good tips on what you need to be doing and things to consider for your biosecurity, that's where you can go. In addition, we also have some activities and on-ground support that we provide. So workshops with different people from the supply chain, from livestock agents through to producers, and willing to work through any of your biosecurity needs. So if you just flick to the next slide, we do have some workshops coming up in the next couple of months. We're just looking for you to save the date. So these are Better Health for Better Wealth workshops that we are running across the state in the various locations and the dates to follow. But what we're looking at is really focusing on livestock health issues that matter to your region. So looking at the enhanced abattoir surveillance data for sheep, and also talking to your local vets, etc., to be able to really make the information that we deliver at these workshops really regionally specific to help you with your production and your animal health on farm. So if you are looking to want to keep in touch with us about those workshops, then the best way to do that is by registering your interest with Emily Buddle. Her email's just there, and we'll also provide that in the email that Deanna sends out later tonight or tomorrow. Thanks, Deanna.
Great, thanks, Penny. So folks, keep those dates up your sleeve, because we've got Penny and Emily, some great resources here in SA to help you with your biosecurity or meeting your biosecurity requirements. Now, I'm just going to put a last call for questions. We're a few minutes over, so last call for questions in the Q&A, please. And also in the chat, we've got that evaluation link. We would love your feedback, please. It's short, sharp and shiny, I promise. Kathleen, we're going to give the last question of the night to you. Now, we've had a lot of information presented tonight, and so if this is new for you as a producer, you might be finding it a bit confusing. Where does ISC recommend that you would start if you are a bit overwhelmed?
I think if you're overwhelmed, I think it's about going back to basics. I think the first port of call would be to check out the Integrity Systems website and go through the requirements, access those checklists for each of the 7 LPA program areas and the fact sheets that are available, and just get your head around the information that's required. But absolutely, we've got plenty of help. As I said there, we've got lots of things available on YouTube, some fairly simple descriptions for everyone. And then certainly reach out as well. You can shoot us an email, you can ring our customer service team, and we're more than happy to put you in touch with the right people that can help you. But just also bringing in the team from PIRSA and Livestock SA as well. So certainly across the different requirements and what you need. So we'd be more than happy to give you a hand as well. But I'd probably start with the Integrity Systems Company website and go from there. And if you can't find the information, reach out and somebody will be able to find it for you.